I am Kristen Overstreet, a senior partner at Origin Editorial, which is an editorial office services and peer review management company, and also at Origin Reports, which is a journal reporting software. Dr. Jason Roberts is also a senior partner at Origin Editorial and Origin Reports. He was the founding president of the International Society of Managing and Technical Editors, ISMTE, and in 2017, he published the book Peer Review, Reform and Renewal in Scientific Publishing. Additionally, he is an editorial board member of the journal Research Integrity and Peer Review, and he has worked with the Equator Network on elevating reporting standards. Dr. Roberts is considered an expert on editorial office reporting and has spoken at numerous industry conferences on this topic. Jason, take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. So today we're going to start at, I guess, the beginning of reporting. We're going to think about what you do before you get going. This is the first in a series of webinars where I am going to start to get into more specifics in future. So hopefully there's a few here today that you can take away. The other thing that you should know is that a couple of these slides you may have seen before at various conferences, but I intend to put a new twist on them. And I'm going to, without that, any further ado, I'm going to get underway. So an answer is only as good as the question. So really, what do I mean by that? Well, it truly is the question that you ask of the data will lead to you getting a better quality data set, a better answer maybe. The problem is that we often deal with imprecision. We just very vaguely say, well, I'm interested in learning more about this, and then you just go. And I think what you need to do is possibly refine the questions that you ask yourself. Okay, so the outline of the presentation is this. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what do we mean by data. I said we're going to begin at the beginning. We're going to frame we're going to talk about framing the question, document what you did. That's a critical thing that unfortunately most people don't do. And I'm going to explain why that's a problem today. Then we'll go over presentation and interpretation. And again, I'm conscious of the fact that most of you are likely to be editorial office staff, so you will know what the data means that I'm going to show you today. We will look at briefly at some of the problems of editorial office reporting, but that's actually going to be a theme of all the webinars that we do. And then finally, I'll just throw out a little reporting checklist for you all to consider when you undertake your reporting. Okay, so data, what is it and why we need it? Well, in editorial offices, we need it really for two things. We use it in a summary way to summarize the how we're doing, how many submissions you've received, what's the turnaround time. We also use it operationally. So we might use it to, as in my first point here, to monitor the progress of manuscripts through peer review. So, you got it at an operational level, which might be stuff that you're using in the back end to tell you what's going on. And then there's the reports that are the fancy ones that you put on the editorial board display report. So we also need data to set benchmarks and then measure our performance. So, Christy and I, in running Origin, we've worked at many, many journals over the years or seen inside many journals. And quite often people are just working blind. They don't really know what's going on in their journal. They've no way to measure their performance against previous years. They probably tell you how many submissions that they've got. But if you were to say, has your conversion rate of reviewers from invitations to review to actual reviews improved or decreased, they couldn't tell you. And now some of that's a function of the fact that, you don't understand how editorial manager reports of enterprise analytic reports or Scholar One reports with Cognos reports or all the other systems, they all have their reporting packages. So that there's a function there. And if you are able to do that, then, presently you have to use Excel, which was one of the reasons why we came up with Origin reports, is to try and remove all of that. And so, if you can just get the basic data out, you can then just run the report that you need. You don't need to worry about having to do all the mathematics and understanding relational databases and how to extract data. So again, the final point as to why we need data, and this is maybe a less obvious one, is that we can use it to anticipate and plan for future behaviors by detecting patterns. So, I mean, you know, a common one that I use it for is detecting reviewer behaviors. You know, have they changed over time? Are reviewers more likely to, you know, agree to an invitation to review than they were 5 years ago? Have I changed something in my system and now I want to measure the effect of that intervention? You know, perhaps we said that we were only going to write personal invitation emails. Did that make a difference to the acceptance rate of invitations to review? And so by anticipating, of course, then you can take remedial action. You can also create policies to ensure the problem is not repeated in the future. Okay, so to develop this point a little bit further, and I'm going to move beyond the theory quickly because I appreciate this is not for everyone, but we have to remember that data is essentially abstract and not absolute, and that many of these data points don't actually exist until we ask, you know, to look for them. Okay, so you know you have your submissions, and they're in the submission database. This is what relational databases are. You've got submissions over here. You have on your, you know, another database, which might be the review behaviors. Then you've got another database, which is the author behavior, the author demographics, that kind of stuff. So what we do with our reporting, consciously or otherwise, is we're stitching together all these different data points. And if you don't stitch them together right, you can actually end up with very imprecise data. As I actually learned to my cost earlier this year, if I can just give an example, is that I will fully admit I'm not the world's greatest user of enterprise analytic reports. You know, I do struggle a bit with the tables and charts sometimes. That's not a criticism of that tool. It's just a criticism of my inability to wrap my head around what I need to do. And you know, I found that I wasn't reporting something quite right. I was reporting on the number of revisions I received, and I would take that number and I'd put it in an Excel spreadsheet. So in my opinion, once I moved to February, January is an absolute number, you know, where I'm now in February. And then I'd go back and find, oh, my January number had changed when I run the report in February, or when I run the report again in March. And eventually I found out it was because I'd made the wrong connection, and that it was how I defined what a revision was, and that there was a perfectly right way of doing it, and I hadn't done it. Now that was just a system-based thing, but sometimes it's not the system; it's just what we've chosen to connect, and we're actually not quite looking at the right thing, or a different thing, I should say, because a point that I've made before is that 100 editorial office staff, everyone on this call right now, if we were given the task of reporting on something or other, I think we'd come up with different looking reports, different answers, different ways of measuring things, different ways of comparing things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one is right and everyone else is wrong. It's just that things are different. And why do I say that? Well, because it's in the way that we frame the question. I'm back to that point again. It's just that I may have framed a question a certain way. I want to count, you know, criteria X, and I want to measure it from this point to X, point A to point B over time period X and Y. And you might be choosing to measure it from points X and Y over a different time period. And, you know, that might be fine too. You know, so sometimes just the subtle change of the question and the data can lead to a difference in return of the results that we report. That does lead to problems with comparisons when we define things so differently, particularly if you are inheriting data, you know, you're new to the editorial office, or you've inherited reports that someone else ran in the past, and, you know, this is why I don't quite get these numbers. It doesn't mean to say that they were wrong and you were right, or vice versa. It just means that obviously they framed their question differently. There's no right or wrong way. There's just your way. Okay. So just to give you an example of this, to really get down to the granular level, even easy questions can become complicated very quickly. And I've learned this from trying to develop the reports with Sherry Hill in Origin reports, is that it can get very complicated. What do we actually mean when we say how many submissions in the calendar year? One would think that's the easiest question in the world to answer. Surely that's a concrete number. I've only had submissions. You know, there's nothing else to it. There's submissions. They come in, we do something with them, and they go out. Well, actually, no. What do you do with withdrawn papers? Do you count them? Again, no right or wrong. Some journals I know don't count them. Some journals do. I personally do count them because at some point I processed them, but other people don't, and that's fine. Do you count papers that were returned to authors? So what we mean by that is, okay, they submitted something, you sent it back. Now, Most of the time, authors will then send it back in again. You might have sent it back for a technical check reason. But what if they never send it back? And you'll be surprised how often that happens. So when you actually trawl your data, you go, oh, we never received something back. Do you count resubmitted papers differently? So let's say you have the option of reject and resubmit. It comes in with a new manuscript number. Now, personally, I count them as different entities, because if it's been rejected and resubmitted, it's usually on the grounds that you are completely rewriting this paper. Otherwise, it's a revision. But somebody else might do that differently, and that's fine. I just also, the other reason why I do it is frankly just because it's easier, because it'd be really hard to separate them out. I'd come up with maybe different categories and ways of flagging it. That just makes my reporting way more complicated than it needs to be. Do you count solicited papers differently? So, maybe, you count, when we say submissions, you're talking about unsolicited submissions and commission submissions. So, you split the data that way. What is your journal turnaround time to decision? That is one of the most complicated things of all to measure. And it's one thing that we're often asked. Do you report the initial times, the time to initial decision? Do you exclude immediate decisions? Again, no right or wrong answer. It's just your answer. But I appreciate it if you inherit an editorial office and you're thinking, why are we so much slower? Maybe they did include the immediate decisions. Maybe they didn't. If they didn't record it, we don't know. So whatever you decide, stick with it in the future, okay? All right, so framing your question, defining parameters. There are no industry standard definitions. There really isn't. People ask me all the time, well, what's the way to measure this? I says, I don't know, because nobody's ever sat down and defined it. I don't think you could. Journals do things in so many different ways. Here's a classic example. How long does peer review take from the moment that you assign an editor? What are you measuring there? Are you measuring it from the moment that the first reviewer is picked? Are you measuring it from the moment the first reviewer agrees? Some people do both. You might not be focused on the elapsed time at all, from the moment that the editor starts picking reviewers to the moment that they make their recommendation or their decision. You might just simply be measuring the time it took reviewers. And even then, what do you measure, as this graphic shows here? The mean turnaround time in both of those illustrations is 14 days. But in one scenario, peer review took 14 days because both reviewers agreed on the same day and both took 14 days. And in the other scenario, one agreed on day 1 and they completed theirs on day 14, which happened to be the day that reviewer 2 agreed to do their review, and they took 14 days. So in short, until standard definitions emerge, use your own parameters. So I've got 3 tips for you today. This is tip number 1. Identify potential outliers, confounders, and exceptions to your data and decide whether the data should be included. So think about what might be problematic with your data and decide what are you going to do with it. Maybe you're just going to say, I'm going to do nothing with it. So when I report turnaround times, I had 3 papers that took 300 days and they're going to, warp my mean, but fine, I don't care. Equally, you may be like, well, I'm going to remove those before I do that. Okay. If you do remove them, make a note that you did that. And I need to practice what I preach, or at least what I preached years ago and I wasn't doing. Now I definitely do it. Is that occasionally I would forget that. Oh yeah, I actually excluded a bunch of papers for whatever reason. And that's the other thing, is that if you make a note that you're excluding something, tell people why. So just to illustrate that tip, the time to initial decision. So maybe you exclude immediate accepts and immediate rejects. So ask yourself that question. Ask yourself that before you start reporting. Am I going to do that? Are there certain article types that you're going to exclude? So if I'm doing turnaround time, I might exclude things like letters to the editor, because the journal I work on most of the time, the editor often waves those through without full peer review. So, it looks like it took 2 days to do peer review on that letter. Extremely slow papers be excluded because of known exceptional issues? Maybe you have to park a paper because you have to investigate an ethics issue. Maybe there's some other thing, there's a major statistical issue and you're waiting on a statistician, and statisticians often have to take a long time to research a point. So, that's a known problem. That article is now a known problem. Is it really representative of your peer review process? Not really. So maybe you want to exclude that. Maybe you had a situation that an editor, was, in hospital for a month and everything just sat there and there was nothing that you could do. Here's one that I never thought about, and Sherry Hill clued me into this. This is an editorial manager one where, do you measure from initial submission date or first receipt date? And I'd never really thought about that. I just, I thought the date that it came in was the date that it came in. But no, I mean, there's the date that it was submitted, but there's also the date that maybe you actually checked it in. And for some people, that's when it's like, now it's in and now we're going to count it. Okay, so again, just many different ways of reporting these things. My next section of the presentation is critical. It's absolutely critical, and almost none of us do it. It's documenting what you did. What do I mean by that? Note the data sets that you included and excluded, and actually note that on the reports that you generate. And I'm going to show you how in a minute. But you can do, I mean, if you use an Excel, you can put it in there in your reports. Just take the time to record what you put into your report. What did you include? What did you exclude? Record the time period studied. I know that sounds obvious, but particularly if you're doing mid-year reporting, did you actually report it through the end of Q2? Or did you report it in, the 18th of July or something like that, which is what I did the other day for my Q2 reports. Now, I did put it back to the end of Q2, but I know in the past I've actually forgotten to do that. And then I've put the report in and thought, why did my numbers not actually match? It's because I was reporting on July the 18th. What do you do with blank cells? This is a common problem and it can make a mess of your data. Did you just scratch all that data out? There may be a reason for doing that. There may not be. I don't know. I don't know why the cells are blank, but sometimes the cells are blank when you export your data. Just decide what you're going to do with that. Were there any outliers removed? Record that. Record what they were and why you removed them. Highlight if an intervention took place, especially if data are subsequently transformed. If you suddenly have a chart that does a hockey stick, what happened? Maybe in the editorial office, if submissions suddenly went through the roof, was it because maybe you had a special issue commission that was doubling the size of submissions you were going to receive that year? It's important to write that down because a few years from now, people will have forgotten what was going on back then. I mean, I think we're all going to remember what COVID is, but that's a classic example right there, is that most of us, our submission levels went through the roof. So, make a note of what was going on. Also, if you are doing more complex analysis, make a note of what you're actually using to report it in. So if you're using a statistical package, make a note of that as well. Okay, tip 2, documenting what you did. Document the parameters used. Save the reports that you use to generate the data if you are using a tool that will allow you to do that. And that's the best way to show accuracy over time. Now, what I mean by accuracy is not whether the data is right or wrong. It's just that when you run the report 2 years from now, you're running it the same way as you did 2 years ago, and you've not shifted the goalposts. That's what I mean by that. And so this is something that I do religiously now because I generate most of my reports through Origin Reports. I mean, this is just the most basic submission chart, bar chart that I do. But now, thanks to the system, because it does it automatically for me, I actually record the parameters. So I make a note of the time period. I was looking from these dates in 2000. You see, I did run this on the 19th of July. So I was doing a year-to-date report. I mentioned the manuscripts that I included. In this case, I'm only reporting on 2 article types. I'm not reporting on letters to the editor. I'm not reporting on case reports. I'm just reporting on research submissions and review articles. I'm only reporting on initial submissions, R0s. If I was reporting on revisions, you would say R1, R2 there. I've reported on every country in the world except Canada and the United States, which is an odd thing to do, but I just decided I'd do that. Just a section category. Maybe you have sections within your journal. It's it defines the subset of that field. You can report on that. If you do, then make sure that you know what it is that you included. Okay. I also save my reports, and I try to just make sure that I use the same criteria the next time. So I save my mid-year editorial reports, and I have a vast array of reports that I run, and I output data. I save them. I don't save the data, the numbers. I just save the reporting criteria. And that, alternatively, if you're using Excel, just write it down so that you know next time, okay, this is how I did it last time. This is precisely how I'm going to do it this time. Okay, so this is maybe the more juicy bit, if some of that was getting a little bit theoretical or a bit in the weeds. Interpretation. I'm going to go through a couple of things, presentation and interpretation, because one thing can feed the other. And the classic example of that, as you may have experienced, is when you are in your editorial board meeting and you put up a chart and you think it looks great, and all the editors, who are of course not professionals like you, come away with a completely different opinion of things. Now that could be, there's two things going on. There's one is that you then need to provide your interpretation to help contextualize the data. Alternatively, it could be that your presentation makes sense in your head, but it's not going to make sense to anyone who's not an expert in peer review management. So I'm a big fan of clear visual presentation. If I see multiple colors on a chart, I'm thinking there's too much going on here, it's too busy. It doesn't help me. I'm colorblind. I sometimes sat there going, I have no idea what this is. This green or is this brown? What am I looking at here? I find that clear visualization helps aid interpretation by revealing patterns. I'm a big fan of scatter plots because then you start to actually see where the data is spread out. A number in itself only tells you so much. The spread of the data tells you everything. So charts can act as an interpretive shortcut if presentation time is limited. If you've got just a table, that's great. All the details there. But if you've got somebody's attention for 30 seconds on that particular slide, sometimes a visual is the way to go. So this is one that I came up with an editor-in-chief of mine a few years ago, because I used to just give him a literal written description of our rejection rate was this, our acceptance rate was this, we put X number of papers in peer review, and he was like, this is so hard to understand. In my head, it was perfectly easy. I'm just writing the words down that makes sense to me. So he and I just came up with a visual flowchart, which was look at all the manuscripts that were unsolicited that came in, and then he said, I want to park off on one side anything that has an immediate decision. I'm not interested so much in them, but I do want to know about them. And then let's look at, well, what happened to all of those that went into full peer review? And then, in this next level here, we're looking at, well, okay, those that went into peer review, 55% were then rejected and 45% were eventually accepted or revised, depending on how you want to draw this chart. So, what we then did was we came up with a way to then say, well, the overall rejection rate, so if you add 229 papers and 60 papers, it was 86% of the total number of unsolicited manuscripts submitted. So once I did this, he got it. And then, so this became a thing that went into every editorial board presentation, and it seems everyone else sort of got it then. It was a nice visual clue. This is one that I love. This is a chart that I presented a couple of years ago at Council of Science Editors, and people were going pretty wild about it. But it's a report that we all do, which is, I'm looking simply here at the associate editors for a journal. How many manuscripts did they get assigned? What was the mean days for them to post an initial decision? And what was their rejection rate? So all of that is in this table here in the upper right quadrant over here. But what we have in this chart here is days from assignment on the x-axis. So, 65 days is, it's like roughly in about the middle, how long things take to get to an initial decision. And then the rejection rate on the y-axis. The size of the bubble reflects the number of manuscripts that they handled, and then we've just put, just as a visual dynamic here for you, I've just put in the numbers so you can understand it. So here we've got this person, Harrod, has handled more papers than anyone else. We can see that as a quick visual shortcut. This is why I'm showing you this chart, because they're the largest circle. We know because they're at this end on the left side of the chart that they're fast. We also know that they reject a lot. They're up at 78%. They're up. So you can see they're way up here. What do we know about this person? I would interpret this chart to mean this, that Harrod sent a lot of papers, but Harrod also quickly rejects a lot of papers. So maybe is immediately rejecting a lot of papers. And I would suspect that that is the case simply because in the parameters down here, I can see that all decision types are included. So almost certainly every journal pretty much has an immediate decision. So immediate decisions are included. What's happening over here with this individual, Santos, is that they are taking a long time compared to the other associate editors. However, they are rejecting at a very high level. So maybe Santos is working in an area of the field that requires more detailed analysis. Maybe there's a lot of statistics, so you've got to sit there with the data and work through the data more. And maybe Santos just does more considered reviews and gets very thorough reviews in and finds, well, they're methodologically flawed, I'm going to have to reject the paper. Perhaps we could speculate this person over here is much more sort of, well, it looks fine to me, and I'll let it through. Here's another chart that I love using. And the point of this is a data visualization is this helps prove a point. I developed this chart years ago because I had an editor that was insistent on changing all the reminders for reviewers. And I said, this is ridiculous. Like, this person wanted to just get rid of most of the reminders. People hate reminders, he said. So I came up with a chart that actually showed you that reminders actually made a difference. So what we have here are number of days on the x-axis, from the day that a reviewer says yes to the day that the reviewer gets the review in. So this person over here took like 48 days to get it done, okay? The y-axis shows the frequency of times that a reviewer got something in. So in this example here, I had 20 reviewers that actually did their review inside 24 hours, 0 days, okay? Okay. What are these lines here? These are actually the reminder letters that went out. And what we have here is that, oh, look, 7 days before the actual deadline day, which is the star, I send out the reminder. Look what happens. I get a small boost in the number of submissions, of revisions that come in. So send out the reminder. I get a boost in the number of reviews that come in. I'm sorry, I can't speak for some reason. And then it drops down. And then I send out another reminder and it starts to build. Every journal I've ever run this chart on, the peak day that you get the number of reviews returned is the deadline day. This curve is typical of a clinical medical journal. I find with the basic sciences or the hard sciences, it tends to be more of a bell curve. It sort of starts low. People don't do their reviews quickly. They take their time. It builds up and then it drops off. This is a little bit more sort of quick start, little boost, really big boost, drops off. I send another reminder later, boom, up it goes again. This is what I mean. This is a visual clue. I could not have presented this in any other way to convince the editor. We have to keep the reminders the way that they are. Now, equally, if you want to adjust your reminders, go ahead and do it. You could measure what happened before using a chart like this and then measure it afterwards, after a period of time, to see has that changed things. Okay, so interpretation. This is where you all need to have confidence in yourself if you work in an editorial office. I don't know if you all do, but I assume most of you do, is that you understand your data, you understand what's going on in your journal, okay? And you need to understand that there are confounders, and you may well know what they are. So let's look at this as an example. Examining rates of rejection of invitations to review. So all of us probably report, we found that 50% of invitations to review led to somebody saying no. Okay, they weren't interested in reviewing, or they never responded, something like that. But then you could break that data down, because you know that not everyone in your reviewer pool is exactly the same. And that even if they are the exact same people, that there may be different circumstances going on at that time. Has that individual reviewed for your journal previously? That might affect whether they're going to say yes or no. Have they reviewed inside the last 30 days? So you might ask me in June to review a paper and I say yes, but ask me in July and I might say no, because I just did a review for you in June. I've got to focus elsewhere. So that might affect your data. Okay, so maybe you look for patterns like that. So it's like, well, if we look at the behavior of people that we invited that had done a review inside 30 days, and then we look at people that did invited to do a review that had been 30 days or longer, whatever. Who invited them, and does that make a difference? So you need to pass your data down and look at that. Maybe some associate editors are doing something. Maybe they're super powerful and everyone wants to review for them. Maybe there's someone that's just super nice and friendly and they're like, oh, okay, I'll do it because it's you, that kind of thing. Well, you can measure that perhaps in the data. How relevant is the paper to a reviewer's area of expertise? That might confound things. You're probably not going to be able to measure that. I know I couldn't, but it's like, well, how good was this paper matched? How well was that paper matched to that person? I mean, like if you gave me a paper on quantum physics and I agreed to review it, it's a terrible match, but I'm never going to agree to review it because I don't know anything about quantum physics. So if you give me a paper, you've already loaded the system to say, somebody's going to say no, okay, if you give them the wrong paper. What type of paper? If you give somebody a massive systematic review to review, they might be inclined to say no if it's the middle of the summer holidays. If you give them an obvious 1,000-word case report, then maybe it's like, fine, I'll just do it. It's going to take me an hour. Okay, so this is what I mean by confounders. There are many. But confounders can change the responses over time or influence an individual's response at a specific moment. So make a note of those confounders as well. The incorrect use of data sets, which can render statistical outcomes meaningless. Here's three that trip people up all the time. Using the year of submission to measure turnaround time to an initial decision, rather than collecting data based on the decision date. So what do I mean by that? Well, I have to do this now for one of our journals because it's the way that they want it to do it. So for 2021, they say, what's our turnaround time in 2021? They only want me to look at submissions that came in 2021. But okay, great. But that means pretty much anything in January and February, which was submitted in the year previously, is not being considered. But, you know, we were still working in January and February. So, you know, again, you know, I personally wouldn't report it that way. That's the way they want to report it. But what I'm saying is that I personally think that makes the data rather meaningless. Anyway, that's one example. Looking at revision response times by author without considering the nature of the revision. You know, fine, most of us probably just give a general metric. You know, it takes authors 35 days to complete a revision. But maybe you should be passing that down into, well, is it major revision or minor revision? Minor revision, they probably do it really quickly. If you're asking people to do major revisions, how long is it taking them? You've asked them to do a lot of work. How long is it taking them? But if you don't really ask the right question there, you're going to get some fairly meaningless data. Grouping all reviewers together when comparing reviewer turnaround times. So this is what I mean again about confounders. If you have specialist reviewers, a statistical reviewer who, you know, in my experience, typically take a long time. If you have a patient reviewer, maybe they are doing things very differently. So do you include them or exclude them? Again, that's up to you, but make sure that you're aware that one or the other could warp your data. And an overall mean will disguise subtleties in the data. So that's important. If you're thinking about if you just give the mean time of 13 days, you know, there could be a lot of bias in that data. Okay, so my third tip is supplement your results and data presentation with your expert analysis. Don't just give a table to a bunch of people, you know, editors that are, you know, clinicians in their day job and doing this at night and just, you know, just leave it like that. Give interpretation, give your, you know, reasoning as to why you think a trend is happening. Don't let them start to come up with their reasons because they don't know as much as you do. As to what's going on. You also might know that, you know, because you've got maybe a more global perspective, that two of the associate editors are really stinking it up. And, you know, that's not something that you're going to possibly isolate and name in a public setting, but you know that. So you have to find a way of maybe explaining that away without embarrassing people. So an example of what I've just been saying right there in that tip is that you are able to contextualize results, so document major events. There was a change in the editor-in-chief, the editorial board that can impact performance. You switch submission systems, whatever. Provide your interpretation of implications of a change or a staged intervention. What's your interpretation of that? Well, the new editorial team was slow to understand how to execute their roles efficiently. So when we look back at 2020 data, these folks came on board in 2020, COVID hit, they pretty much had no training. So no wonder we were really slow. Also, COVID, you know, so that's an interpretation of context. That's a really obvious, easy one, but there are many others. Editors committing to inviting reviewers with more personal rather than template-driven emails. This is an example of where I saw an uptick in conversion rates of invitations to review and to acceptances to review because editors were actually asking them editors were actually putting into their letters, I'm asking you to review this because you're the expert in this, or I read your paper on this, or I saw you to give a presentation at this meeting, or, you know, hey Joe, it's great I have not talked to you in a year. It's great to just, you know, connect with you again. I've got this paper. Can you look at it? Those sort of things. We wanted to see, did it make a difference? So, you know, the data changed. I gave my interpretation, but it seems to suggest that there is a pattern when we do that. Justify why you exclude or include certain points because it might not be obvious to some. I saw a journal the other day on its website saying, you know, our turnaround time to initial decision is 12 days. And I thought, well, either you're not doing peer review fully or you are including your initial decisions. And maybe if you've got an 80% initial rejection rate, yeah, if I actually took my journal headache, my turnaround time is 13 days. If I include the initial decisions, it's 26 days when it's not. So, see the difference? So when I promote that 26 days, I do say that's not included, that's for full peer review. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just, as I get near the end now here, mercifully so probably for some of you, but I'm just want to point out some of the problems that I see with editorial office reporting or publisher reports on editorial performance, which is what I'm giving here. These are actually from an editorial office. These are actually from publishers. And the first point I want to make is that poor visualization really can harm the message that you're trying to convey here, or the usefulness of it. So this chart, which is article downloads trend. So yes, I can see a trend. First of all, don't write the data out this way. That's really hard to read. But I can see a trend. Something happened in 2018 and boom, off we went. Wonderful. But precisely what is this number? I mean, maybe I don't need to know it to the nearest, 100 even, but I mean, is that 870,000? Is that, 860,000, 850? I have no clue because I haven't put the numbers here and there was no table that came on it. You could say add labels or bring along a table to accompany this chart, because otherwise it's kind of meaningless. Great, it's gone up. Inevitably, I'm going to ask the follow-up question, by how much? And and tell me more about these numbers. It was the ultimate in frustration. This chart, this pie chart over here on the right, this came from a major publisher, and they were trying to tell me in my annual journal report, these are the largest commercial spenders at your journal. So basically, pharmaceutical companies that had spent money on advertising, supplements, blah, 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 all the rest of it. They'd produced this pie chart, okay? Now off to the side, which I didn't include for confidential reasons, obviously, was the list of all the companies. Great. Well, first of all, this is really hard to read. I can't even, maybe you can see the colors. I can't see what these colors are. These are so small, I can barely make out what it is. I have no idea what the dollar amounts were for this. Great. I can work out that this company here was maybe, I don't know, whatever that is, 15 to 20%. But I don't actually know what that means in real dollar terms, which is kind of important. If you're telling me what the commercial sales are, I need to know this. So this is an example of somebody trying to create a visual shortcut, but they've actually made it too much of a shortcut. And now I've got to go back and ask for more information. So, that's what I mean by think about when you visualize your data, think about, am I conveying the information I need in the simplest way possible, but also, am I giving them enough information to make this useful? Then we have the issue of poorly defined metrics. And this, again, was from a publisher. And I have no idea who came up with this, other than that I know it's somebody who's never worked in an editorial office, because they would never report this statistic over here. Why isn't it displaying? Here it is, this way. Okay, so 2015, days to first decision, 30 days. That makes sense to most of us. I'm sure most of our journals are somewhere in that area, okay? Days to final decision, 33 days? What the heck is that? Does that mean that it actually just took 3 more days after that the authors immediately returned their revisions and then we posted a decision inside 3 days? I don't know, because nobody explained it. Does it mean that we're maybe reporting on the last revision that came in? So it took 33 days from the day that the last revision came in to when the decision was posted. Most likely that is, but I don't know, because they didn't tell us. So this is what I mean by an ill-defined metric. Somebody thought that made sense, but it really doesn't make any sense at all. And again, they didn't tell us, what revision number they're reporting on. Is it the final revision? Again, no information was provided. So we often find that data is used improperly, and I do see editorial offices doing this a lot. Is that and this leads to the problem of successive reports often fail to show the same thing. So you yourself or somebody comes along to run a report later, and it's different. It's because the methodology was poorly described. We don't know what was included, what was not included. We don't know if they just shifted or used a different report even. So, it's like there are many different ways. So I can think of at least 3 different ways in Editorial Manager that I can get a report on editor turnaround time. Okay, so maybe one report gives me a slightly different number from something else. But if I didn't know which report I used in Editorial Manager, the next time, if I delegate the task to someone else and say, replicate my report, they might come up with very different numbers. then maybe there's a different study population. The inclusion exclusion criteria has been applied differently. Different questions were posed of the data. So an acceptance rate, you may decide that you're going to include things like letters to the editor and editorials. Other people may decide not to. And that changed. And that leads to problems with successive reporting if you changed it. If you do have to make a change, and data, sometimes you do because things have changed at your journal, I always find it best to just go back and apply the new criteria and report all your historic data again. I mean, let's face it, does it really matter if in 2018 that you said you had 275 submissions, and then by 2021 you're running a report and now you've shifted that number by 4 because you've reclassified the way you're going to do it? That's fine. Just report back with your new criteria. It made sense in 2018. It's now 2021. You're using the data that's in front of you as defined in this new way. Other major problems. Too much use of the solitary mean average. And by God, I need to practice what I preach, because I had a major strategy meeting at the weekend, and at 11 p.m. on the Friday night, 2 of the editors wrote to me and said, oh, we didn't run the numbers. Can you run the numbers? And I had no time to run all the reports that I'd like to do. And so the easiest report that I could run was I just pumped out a solitary mean. I said the turnaround time for reviewers, as measured by the individual reviewers from the moment they agree to the moment that they submit, was a mean of 13 days. And then the conversation started going on about, well, what do we do with late running reviewers? And then somebody returned to my point about the mean and said, well, really, I'd preferred it if you'd reported the median and then also showed the spread of data. Or if you're going to report the mean, report the standard deviation. And I was like, I don't understand standard deviation. I'm not a statistician. But I do understand some things about the spread of data. And I think that's important when we do that. And I'll just talk about that briefly in the slide coming up. But the common issues that I do see again with problems in reporting is that there's too much meaning attached to too few data points when asserting a trend. Like literally comparing one quarter to the previous quarter, that's not a meaningful comparison. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't know. I mean, just collectively, sometimes people get slower and then they get faster again, and there's nothing you did, just happens. Okay, that's just how the world is. There's often, I'm just going to get to this last point in the interest of time. There's often generic headline data that is mostly worthless. We need sensitivity, and that returns to this point I was making about the spread of data. There is no measurement of variance. We need to be aware. So, you can calculate standard deviations in Excel. You can calculate it in Origin reports. I do often give it because I figure I'm giving my presentations to a lot of people that do understand this stuff. So maybe they make more sense of it than I do. But I'm more of a visual person. And I'll show you what I like to do in a moment. But also something else you should do if you report that measure of variance is report the range of the data. Okay, so time to initial decision ranged from, and if let's say I've excluded all the immediate stuff, so I'm talking about full peer review, ranged from a very quick 10 days to a maximum of 145 days or something like that. Report that range. It's important that you actually include that. Don't just give the mean. Report, ideally, if you can, the standard deviation. Report the range of that data as well. I have started to use medians more, and I report something called the interquartile range, which you can report in Excel. You just look it up. It's a formula in Excel. It's not complicated. I can calculate interquartile range in as fast as I could do using the sum function. It is there. You just need to know what the formula is. And what is the interquartile range? Well, what we're looking at there is the difference between the point where we all know quartiles are. Take the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. Now, let's say I'm reporting turnaround time, and 100 days was my upper value, and 25% of my data very neatly was 75 days to 100 days. So that's, and then 25% of my data was below 25 days in this neat example of 100 days. So that means my interquartile range, I'm measuring between Q3 and Q1. So I'm measuring quartile 3, 75, and 25. So my interquartile range is 50. Okay, so that's a pretty broad spread. Well, I'm saying that my data is spread. Equally, if I had 100 papers and my interquartile range was 10 days, okay, just by the spread of the data, what do I mean by that? Well, what can I infer from that? Well, what I can infer from that is that my peer review process is consistent. At 50 days, it might be flailing wildly. I've got some really fast papers, all those under 25 days, I've got some really slow papers. If my interquartile range is about 10 days, then it's pretty tight data, okay? If the data is skewed by outliers, calculate the median value and report the interquartile range. That's actually something, however, that Origin Reports does with a click of a button. You can just do this in Excel. It takes you 2 minutes. I honestly recommend that you do this, and you will notice, certainly if you work at a journal where there's people that are, your editors are more statistically inclined, that they will seize on this. Okay, so mercifully so, this is the final slide. I'm sure I've thrown a lot at you here, but this is my reporting checklist, and this is my little tips on what you should do. Define precisely your study question and determine what study items to include and exclude. What phenomenon are you trying to understand? Why do you need to know? Who needs to know? So that's actually the first question I ask people. When somebody says, can you run a report on such and such? I'll be like, what do you need this report for? What is it that you're looking at? So the other day, a new editor-in-chief and his new assistant asked me, I need you to run a review report on Dr. X. And I said, okay, what do you need to know? Do you want to know how fast they are? Do you want to know what their rejection rate is? Do you want to know who picked them? Do you want to know how many times they declined to review? Tell me what you need to know. And then also tell me why you need to know it, because then I will present my data in a way that suits the question that you're asking. My second point, think about potential confounders that could skew your data. Always think about that. If your data starts to look a bit wonky, particularly if you're comparing it to previous years, something's going on. Think about what those confounders are. And again, if you can visualize it, that's a great way of quickly identifying. If you look at the spread of data, say on a scatter plot, you're like, why are those things in the top corner, top right corner over there taking a long time and something else is happening to them? Zero in on them. Have you sufficient data to report with confidence? And that's a much harder one to answer. I mean, statisticians could do that right away, but most of us aren't. But just, meaningfully so. If you've only got you're reporting on editor behavior and they've only looked at 4 papers all year, that might not be, a great comparison if you've also got editors that have done 20 or 30 papers. Document all your reporting parameters. I've hammered that point home, I think, enough times. And determine the most effective way to present your data. So, obviously visually interested to sustain the interest of people, but to also to make them ask questions of the data and go, well, that's interesting. Why is, that person in the bubble chart all the way up there? What are they doing that we're not? Okay, so that was my last slide. So I think if I stop sharing, you'll actually see my face now. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Jason. That was a stimulating presentation that will provide us with some takeaway tips for our journal reporting. I know I always learn something every time you talk on this topic. We do have some questions. We have one that says, are there certain types of charts that are better for certain kinds of data? Should I always use a set type of chart for things like time, submissions, number of reviews submitted, etc.?
Yeah, now, I'm not a statistician, but I know one of them explained to me once that you should report trends, things like time, in a line chart, okay? Whereas like submissions, which is more of like a volume thing, use a bar chart for that. So in that example, that at its most simplistic level, absolutely. Trends definitely look better with a line. You're not really going to see that. But if you want to break things down within that absolute number, then maybe a bar chart is that. So a stacked bar chart, you've got multiple things stacked up in one column. That changes it. If you're just reporting a single number, then maybe a line is better. I don't know if that is where you were going with that question, but certainly that, that's one of the things I would love us to all collectively do as editorial officers, actually come up with some, not absolute criteria on this, but say, hey, if you're going to do this, this is the best way to do it. It's, this works for us, and people go, okay, if it worked for you, then maybe I'll try that in the future. It'd be great if we could learn from each other in that regard.
Some standards for reporting. Yeah, we need ISM to E to pick that up, or CSE. Indeed. Here's another one. I don't know how to calculate interquartile range, and I can't figure it out in Excel. Are there any resources for this? I'm afraid if I did add it to my charts, I wouldn't be able to explain it when asked about it.
Yeah. You can Google it, find out how to do it. Maybe you know, we know who's on the call. I'll just send out literally a dummy data set, and you can just see where it is. It's typically what I do is I always calculate the mean, you know, which you can do as a formula. So I got my, you know, at the bottom of all my data points on that one column, I calculate the median, and then it's I forget what it is now. It's not obvious. It's not like IQ IQR. It's not that, but it's, I forget what it is. But you put the formula in, and then, you know, if you use the formula builder, you can select the quartile. You just put 3, and it tells you what the number is. In my case, before 75, and then I put 1 in the same formula, and it tells me, you know, what the other number is, which is 25, and then just that simple arithmetic, you know, that's 50. I find the best way to do it is to visualize it. So, and box and whisker plots. And what that shows is it literally shows a box where the 50% of your data is, and then it has little tails on either side of it, and that goes down to the lowest point and also up to the highest point. And so if you've got a long tail going upwards, it means that you've got some real stragglers up there that took a long time. But the box is a great visualization, particularly if you compare turnaround time over time, which is what I did once, because I found that my median wasn't changing that much, but my interquartile range got narrower. And what was happening is that over time, the editorial board, the longer they worked on this journal, just got more and more consistent. But there's always going to be papers that throw your numbers out, you know, for whatever reason. So, but overall, collectively, they were more consistent. So I think it's a great way of reporting.
Great. Another question is, how do you determine what is a reject and what is an immediate reject in your data?
Right. So that's actually a really great question, because first of all, you could maybe literally define that as your decision types. So in your when your editor goes to pick a decision, one of them is immediate reject. You know, that you can have an infinite number of rejection terms. But what about those journals where the editor-in-chief has said, well, I'm going to send this out to full peer review? They send it to the associate editor, and then the associate editor says, no, I'm not, I think this is terrible. I'm going to send it back. I think it shouldn't go out to full peer review. It's a waste of our reviewers' time. So many journals will count that as an immediate rejection as well. I do. Now, physically, it will go out with reject, was the name of the decision, because at that point, it's gone beyond the point in the system where the editor-in-chief could make the immediate reject decision. Now, in one of the things that we did with Origin Reports is that with the decision tool, that little chart that you saw that looked like a flow chart, we actually asked the question, do you want to include manuscripts that had 0 reviewers that looked at the paper? Because we're going to make an assumption that if 0 reviewers looked at the paper, it had an immediate decision of one kind or another. I mean, it's not foolproof. Everyone defines things differently, but that's so you've got the way the system defines things, and then there's ways that you may additionally define things. And of course, it's a bit of a nightmare if you do count and you're not using a tool like ours. You then got to combine 2 bits of data together, which is one reason why I developed that report the way I did, because I was sick and fed up of trying to do that. So anyway, that's that. So basically, there's no one standard industry definition. It's not like if it's under 10 days, it's immediate decision. That doesn't exist. It's just you can define it however which way you want, but pretty much it didn't go through full peer review is the definition that I would use.
Okay. Are you planning any more webinars, and do you know what topics might be covered?
We are planning them, and I should know, but after 55 minutes of talking about this, they've all just gone out of my head. I'm sorry, but we are basically going to explore different elements of reporting data. So sometimes it might be thematic, so it could be like better ways to report things like turnaround time. Some of them, it might be, here's a visual way of interpreting data that you may not be using that you can use. You can use it in Excel, you can use it in our tool, you can just run it straight out of Cognos or enterprise analytic reports if you want, but you've maybe never thought about using it. So, you know, there's topics like that. We're going to look again about confounders and what to do, you know, like, well, okay, well, where do I cut off things? You know, so, you know, at what point is this like, that's fine, but anything else above that line is not fine, and it's going to mess with my data. So we're going to delve into those details a bit more. What I can tell you is if you go to, and maybe somebody could just put this in the chat or something like that, if you go to originreports.org, there's information there on upcoming webinars. But we're going to do these every couple of months. And, I tend to be granular. I don't intend to just, talk at high level stuff. I want everyone that attends to come away with things that they can apply to their office.
Wonderful. And then I'll answer this next question. Is there a way that we can suggest topics for webinars? We would love that. You can send it to us by Twitter at Origin Reports, or you can email us. You can email Sherry at shill@originreports.org. You can put them in the chat window right now. Let us know. We would love to know what other topics would be useful to you. And that looks like we've gone through our questions, which is perfect timing because we're at the end of our hour. I want to thank everyone again for attending this first webinar in a series sponsored by Origin Reports. And please stay tuned to your social media channels for announcements of future webinars, when they'll be, what they'll be about. And you can follow us at Origin Reports. Thank you all for being here today, and I hope you have found something today that will help you be more successful in your journal reporting.